Welcome to first of several videos on looking at a variety of data. This first one is on understanding the significance of viewing race ethnicity in our data. You'll see that I'll talk about race ethnicity as in combination, but I'll spend just a few seconds up front to kind of define both of them so that you understand there is a distinction between the two. But for the purposes of looking at data, we're gonna be cognizant that they are used interchangeably as we look at data. So, so let's start first by understanding what is race and what is ethnicity and why it matters, right? There's a couple of things we have to understand. First is race, particularly, is a social construct that at times is reduced to sort of these biological features, right, or markers. And the idea of it is that there's a presumption that those are the markers of race, right? The idea of skin color, hair texture, facial features. But in reality, race is a social construct that as a society, we have utilized over time to mean a great deal of and utilized for a variety of actions. But in reality, we also have to recognize that race signifies and symbolizes a variety of meanings within our society, including cultural reference for a variety of groups, right? So though it is a social construct, it is a real construct in terms of not only sort of how as groups have created sort of the cultural reference around it, but also the significance of how rest of society, how others outside of particular racial ethnic groups also utilize that idea of race to also identify difference and interactions and at times policies with groups. When we're talking about ethnicity, ethnicity serves as another sort of culturally specific social construct that in particular is connected to language and culture and immigrant status and identity labels and many other factors that are surrounding the idea of an ethnic identifier, a label that we kind of carry with each other. But both are such important reference points for understanding sort of the dynamic ways individuals experience the world, right? They're a conglomeration of a very important sort of cultural reference that groups and individuals really develop and over time from generation to generation really utilize as a springboard for redeveloping sort of who individuals and groups are in our society. But for the purpose of what we're doing here today, I wanted us to kind of have that basic grounding so that when we talk about race and ethnicity, we're not just talking about it sort of as this, simplistic sort of very flat reference point as a data point, right? It's like, oh, here's Black kids, here's Native American students, but also recognizing that these identity markers are multidimensional, right? So when we start with looking at data, any sorts of data by any sort of identity category, I want us to make sure and be mindful that it is multidimensional. So let's get started. So we're going to look at race and ethnicity in some of our different sets of school data that we have available to us. And in particular, I'm going to talk about two areas of data. And in particular, we're going to look at using a very specific formula called the risk index, right? And the risk index really gives us an understanding of what percentage is reflective of specific groups. In this instance, obviously, we're talking about race ethnicity in the context of student enrollment and special education data. So let's start with our student enrollment data, which is usually reflective of overall school and district data. Here you'll see a simple and kind of standard sort of table of looking at racial ethnic identifiers. You'll see some of the sort of 6 standard identifying groups. I have to also acknowledge that there are variations that we should keep in mind in terms of these categories. So if we look at the first column where it says American Indian or Alaskan Native, we have to be cognizant that at different parts of this country, it's vitally important for us to not sort of collapse groups, for example, Native Americans and Alaskan Natives into one particular category. It may be relevant for us to sort of really break apart to make those types of distinctions. The same thing can be said for Asian Pacific Islanders. That type of separation also is done in different parts of the country. And even within Asian groups, also breaking that down as well, because in different parts of this country, there are very unique dynamics that are happening for students who are identifying as Vietnamese versus Laos versus Chinese versus Japanese. And then we have our category Black. That is all encompassing. And again, another category that, depending on the part of the country, can also be broken apart. That it's in terms of what's relevant Hispanic, Latino, Latinx, right? Just the terminology itself is also very different in different parts of the country. So you'll see here, I'm trying to keep concert with the fact and recognition that they are existing in different parts of the country. It's referenced a little bit differently. When we get to category white, we not only sort of want to annotate sort of white, but we also want to annotate that not of Hispanic origin. And I should also note the same distinction with Black, right? Part of what that we have to recognize from what the US Census is also sort of annotating is an opportunity for us to kind of see individuals who identify Hispanic or Latinx, and the degree to which they also identify in a racial category like Black or white or Native American or Asian. And we want to make sure that we are capturing the right set of groupings when we are looking at these different groups. So that's why when we look at white or when we look at Black, let's make sure that it is a clean sort of definitional annotation of sort of individual groups where it is students who identify as white and not of Hispanic origin. And similarly with multiracial category. So here, what you'll see, what I'm going to show you is doing the risk index, right? What is this risk index, right? As I mentioned before, it gives us an opportunity to understand the percentage that's reflected in a group. And the formula for the risk index has a couple of steps, right? So it really is about taking the total number of a specific group here. Like in this example that I'm going to start with Native American students, where you have 18 Native American students enrolled in this district. And you want to take that total enrollment number of that group and you want to divide it by the total number of the entire district or school. So you do 18 divided by 7,036 times 100 will give you the percentage or the risk index percentage, right, of that particular group. As a result of those, that type of calculation, right, you get these sets of percentages. Again, it is taking this numeric number, 18, in terms of Native Americans, divided by 7,036, gives you 0.25%. You do the exact same formulaic steps with all these other groups, and you will get these types of percentages. So if you do Asian Pacific Islanders, which is 1,097, divided by 7,036, times 100 gives you 15.6%. And you just follow that, you will see that these percentages that are reflective here are reflective of that particular formula. All right, so let's do the same thing with our special ed data, right? Looking at it by race and ethnicity. So again, we see the same configurations of different groups, and we do the exact same formulaic process with our students with disabilities. In this example, we do Native American students here, which is 0, meaning there are 0 students that identify as Native American that have been identified with a disability. And we take that 0 and we divide it by the total number of students with disabilities, which is 1272. We take 0 divided by 1272 times 100, of course, it's going to give us 0%, right? And so we follow that same formulaic process, and we do that across all the other racial ethnic groups. And there we start to see the percentage that's reflective of students with disabilities in terms of their enrollment in special education. Now, this process, this formulaic process, is something that you want to repeat across all of them. You want to make sure you get your you have the accurate sort of percentages are reflective in this, right? And then you're able to collapse these sort of percentages together and start to be able to look at the relationship between the two, right? This is where it gets really interesting and juicy and exciting, right? Where we take this total student enrollment percentage, right, that we got from the first usage of the formula. And what we want to do is we want to hold that constant to say, okay, this is the percentage of racial ethnic enrollment in my district, right? This is the kids in my district that identify in these particular racial ethnic groups. And I want to compare it to the overall students with disabilities enrollment numbers as well, right? And from the vantage point of disproportionality, right, which is where all of this work really sits under, is we want to understand, is there a proportional representation that's existing in between these set of numbers? In particular, we want to make sure that there's a proportional representation in special education in comparison to overall enrollment. And as you'll see, if you go and you just follow each group, right? So if we look at Native American, they're 0.25% of the district, and they're 0% of students with disabilities. We look at our Asian or Pacific Islanders, they're 15.6% of the district, and they are 9.2% of special education. Our Black students are 36.8% of the overall district and 41.5% of students with disabilities, and so forth and so forth. And what you want to look at is to see, are there the enrollment patterns in terms of special education by race, ethnicity? Is it over or under the percentage of overall enrollment, right? We want to be as close to the enrollment percentage as possible in order for us to understand, is there proportional representation? Now, the next part of also using the exact same risk index formula is looking at it by what's called high incidence categories. High incidence identification categories are the categories that research has identified are categories of special education that are occurring at high incidence rates. And they're occurring in high incidence rates either as a result of its overutilization, and also the degree to which these categories also represent a level of subjectivity in terms of their application. So with the set of raw numbers that you see here, we want to apply the exact same risk index formula, right? We want to do the calculation of taking one particular subgroup divided by the total number at the end of their row and multiply it by 100. And that'll give us the percentage. And so what you'll see here also is you'll notice that the high incidence categories will not total up to the total number of students with disabilities, because obviously there's a lot more categories that the students are also identified in. But with these particular high incidence categories, we want to take a particular notation around them because of what I mentioned before. They happen frequently and they carry a great deal of subjectivity. And these four: emotional disturbance, learning disability, speech or language impairment, other health impairment, are ones that across the country we are noting are occurring in rates and carry a level of subjectivity that require close attention to understanding how is it showing up for a variety of racial and ethnic groups. So we do the calculations, that same risk index calculation, and these are the percentages we get. And just like I said before, when we were comparing the overall enrollment with the student with disabilities enrollment, we want to do the same thing again with the high incidence categories. And we want to look to see, is there proportional representation, right? Are students, in terms of their enrollment patterns, are they similarly experiencing or being identified in specific identification categories in the rest of this column here? And that's the work that we want to do, right? So that's your example. That's now you're ready to do risk index, right? You can to start practicing in terms of this particular racial and ethnic data. And the last thing I'll say, as I'll leave you with, is a question for us to ponder as we do this work is, I want you to consider, as a result of this, also understanding, as we started off with this conversation talking about recognizing that race and ethnicity is multidimensional, I want us also to consider at the back end, as we think about this data, is how do students from these different racial and ethnic groups experience special education enrollment? What is it that they are experiencing that may also give us a more multidimensional understanding of what's transpiring? Thank you for listening, and good luck in analyzing your own data.